Good afternoon, everyone. In today's lecture, we will be looking at the Eastern Front in the Second World War, known in the victorious Soviet Union as the Great Patriotic War. After covering initial German successes, we will follow Stalin's legions west as they carved a new socialist world from the lands which they entered. Central and Eastern Europe would never be the same again. Although Hitler had won a mighty victory over France and established German hegemony in Europe, there was never any doubt that the German dictator was always planning on invading the Soviet Union. Under the Nazis' racist ideology, the lands of Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics, owned by the Soviets, were to form an agricultural heartland with which to feed the Germans and settle the excess German population. The Slavic peoples already living in these countries were to be used as slave labor and then disposed of. Hitler designed this concept of Lebensraum through an observation of settler colonialism in California and Australia, seeing Germany's drive east as its own version of manifest destiny. As well as winning the lands of Ukraine for Germany, a victory over Stalin would also destroy the Marxist ideological enemy and cement the triumph of fascism. Few observers gave the Soviets much hope of resisting the German advance. In the late 1930s, Stalin's Great Purges had weakened the organization of his army as he ordered a number of generals to be executed for working against the revolution. Most of the evidence used against these generals was trumped up and forced confessions were extracted after torture. In 1939, a routine invasion of Finland had become something of a disaster as committed Finnish troops fighting in the winter on home turf inflicted a number of casualties upon the poorly organized and equipped Soviet forces. The invasion of Poland the same year, undertaken to improve Soviet defenses, had actually weakened them as the Soviet troops now positioned themselves tens of miles forward from the fortifications they had believed that they would be defending. In both Poland and the Baltic states, the Soviet conquests of 1939 and 1940 were also accompanied by mass killings of the middle classes, which ended any chance of much support from the local population. Hitler's forces duly invaded Soviet Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine in the summer and fall of 1941 and won a series of massive battles against the Soviet forces. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured in great encircling actions which decimated the Soviet army. Stalin ordered that anyone surrendering was to be executed and hurriedly brought in soldiers from Siberia and Central Asia to shore up the front. In Ukraine and the Baltics, local people at first heralded the occupying Germans as liberators. It was thought that the Germans, as a people of the so-called West, would rule in a more enlightened way than the Soviets had done, and would give autonomy to the nations of the region. Instead, Nazi rule was from the start violent, exploitative, and chaotic. Jewish people in the occupied lands were either shot with the help of local collaborators or rounded up into cramped and unsanitary ghettos. The Nazis also killed political prisoners, either by shooting or plain mistreatment. Whilst the Soviets lost enormous numbers of troops and miles upon miles of land, their soldiers did fight extremely bravely, and the invading forces found it harder than they thought to go forwards. The Germans slowed to a crawl, inching towards Moscow before the snows fell and they froze. A massive Soviet counterattack made it clear that the Soviets were far from defeated. Supplies began pouring in from the US and the UK. One of my own great-grandfathers served on a ship protecting merchant ships setting out to supply the Soviet ports. As well as defending Moscow, the Soviet forces managed to hold out in Leningrad in the most desperate of conditions, winning them admirers across the world. In the spring and summer of 1942, the Germans launched a massive offensive across the plains of southern Russia. Their target were the oil fields of Baku, where they could win enough oil to supply their tanks and planes for the remainder of the conflict. Supplies coming to the Soviet soldiers in the south came down along the Volga River. A key stop along this river was the city of Stalingrad, which was also a major industrial center. Hitler diverted an entire German army, backed with Romanian and Hungarian troops, to take the city. This fighting for Stalingrad, block by bloody block, was some of the most horrific in human history. Eventually, the Soviet troops smashed through the Romanians and encircled the Germans within the city. The entire German Sixth Army surrendered, including a high-ranking field marshal. The disaster at Stalingrad terrified Central and Eastern Europeans alike, but by now they were too caught in Hitler's web to do anything as a system of total war was implemented upon them. Men were conscripted, political enemies forced to work as slave laborers, and all dissent quickly crushed. The Germans set up a number of killing centers where they began to systematically kill Jewish people from across Europe. The Nazis saw Jewish people as the racial enemy of the Germans, subhuman and unhygienic, yet at the same time capable of dastardly intrigue. As German military defeats piled up, plans to kill all of Europe's Jewish population became ever more urgent. Local collaborators and allies worked with the Germans to deport as many Jewish people as they could from their countries. Italy, where many Jewish Italians had once greeted and supported fascism, was no exception. Whilst Jewish people were the primary victims at the killing centers, Roma, prisoners of war, political prisoners, and LGBTQ victims were also killed there. When the residents of the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw realized the reality of what was happening, they rose up, as did Jewish partisans in Lithuania and Belarus. When the Jewish uprisings ended in failure, many found it better to die fighting than to be herded into a camp and worked to death or gassed. Behind the German front lines, committed communists organized bands of fighters or partisans who attacked German military targets before retreating back into the safety of the woods and the marshes. To combat these partisans, who operated not only in Belarus and Ukraine, but also the Baltics, Greece, and Yugoslavia, the Germans and Italians engaged in widespread atrocities against the local people, sometimes forcing entire villages, slaughtering entire villages. Violence against civilians, exercised in all forms, became just a way of life at the front. The Germans were no longer seen as heroes, but were now despised, as were the local collaborators, who met a grisly fate once they were captured. By 1944, it was the Soviets' turn to go on the offensive, which they did in the north, center, and southern fronts. In the center they had the most success, smashing through German lines in the summer of 1944 in Operation Bagration, which advanced into Poland. The killings at the extermination centers furthest to the east were forced to halt and the camps closed. When the advancing Soviets found evidence of the killing, they informed the Western powers, who were either too disbelieving or too distracted to do anything about them. Germany's allies began jumping ship. In early summer 1944, Finland sued for peace and was given terms only slightly worse than those of 1940. In August, a coup d'etat by King Michael in Romania resulted in that country changing sides. In September, the USSR declared war on Bulgaria, which was, before that, neutral, and a pro-Allied coup brought that country onto the Soviet side as well. As the Soviet army neared the Carpathians, Hitler offered the Hungarian leader, Admiral Horthy, a choice between full cooperation as a German puppet or an undisguised German occupation as an enemy. On March 19th, While the admiral was visiting Hitler, the Germans began the occupation of his country. They suppressed parties and organizations of potential opponents and arrested their leaders. With the cooperation of Hungarian authorities, Jewish Hungarians deported to the gas chambers of German killing centers. Jewish Hungarians were deported to the gas chambers of German killing centers, Auschwitz in particular. Some 550,000 of Hungary's 800,000 Jewish residents were murdered. In October, Horthy announced an armistice with Moscow, but the Germans then abducted him and forced him to abdicate. The ultra-fascist Iron Cross Party now ran Hungary, and for 6 months the Hungarians and Germans fought fiercely for every inch of land. This fighting resulted in mass destruction and many evils being visited upon the Hungarian civilians. In Poland, the advance of the Soviet army encouraged the Polish resistance, the Home Army, to launch an uprising. Partly, the Poles were motivated by the fact that Stalin's forces could offer support, and partly they wished to seize their country before the Soviets got a chance to install a communist government. The Polish government, in exile in London since 1939, increasingly found the British and the US unsympathetic to their cause, as both sought to placate the Soviets' wishes. In the end, the so-called Warsaw Uprising ended in tragedy. The Home Army received no support from the Soviets, who not only halted their own offensive, but also refused to allow Allied planes to help resupply the Poles. The insurgents fought the SS alone for 63 days, during which Warsaw had been almost totally destroyed, and 200,000 civilians and more than 10,000 combatants had perished. In March 1945, Stalin added salt to the Polish wounds by having 16 leaders of the Polish resistance arrested and tried in Moscow. In spring 1945, the Soviets mopped up German resistance in the Baltics and invaded Germany proper. Stalin wanted his forces to conquer Berlin before the Allies, and at an incredible cost of lives, he got his wish. Everywhere the Soviets advanced, soldiers committed atrocities against civilians in revenge for the crimes committed by the Germans earlier in the war, and a legacy of hatred and resentment grew, which was not to be forgotten. Following Hitler's suicide, Central and Eastern Europe was now Stalin's to do with as he wanted, and despite the vain efforts of the British and the US officials at international conferences, democracy would not return to the region until the 1990s. Instead, Stalin annexed the Baltics and northern Romania to the Soviet Union, and also added East Prussia, renaming the ancient Prussian capital of Königsberg to Kaliningrad. In Romania, Stalin ensured that the communists came out on top in their struggle with the democratic parties, which had been going on underground during the years of dictatorship. Stalin forced the Romanian king to appoint the Communist Party to government in March 1945, after which it used its control of the security apparatus and other key government agencies to suppress all opposition. The British and US governments did little to stop them. The Communists delayed elections till November 19th, 1946, suppressing opposition the entire time. They then falsified the results, declaring that they had received 80% of the vote. The Communist Party proceeded to eliminate the remaining opposition in a campaign that culminated in show trials and the sentencing of democratic leaders to long prison terms. King Michael was forced to abdicate, and a Romanian People's Republic was declared on December 30th, 1947. Bulgarian communists and their Soviet advisors moved forcefully to eliminate the internal opposition. In September 1946, a fixed referendum declared by a 93% majority that Bulgaria was a republic. Democratic leaders were, however, arrested and executed. Bulgaria was a low priority for Britain and the US, so both countries did nothing. Yugoslavia was not liberated by Soviet troops, but rather won back its own freedom with the communist partisans under Tito defeating entire German and Italian divisions. As a result, whilst Yugoslavia would become a communist country, it enjoyed a lot more freedom from the Soviets than the other countries of the region. The communist government still nationalized large landholders and public utilities and launched rapid industrialization. Within Yugoslavia, each national group was given a degree of freedom in how to run themselves, with memories of the Serb-dominated 1920s still fresh. The atrocities of the war years were not, however, forgotten or forgiven. In 1948, Tito split with Stalin, and despite the latter's continuous attempts to kill him, managed to balance a position somewhere between the countries of the East and the West. In Greece, a civil war broke out, with communist guerrillas in the north controlling much of the country by 1947. The communists, however, were not given aid by Stalin, who considered Greece to be in the Western sphere, and so were defeated by 1949, with US dollars keeping Greek finances afloat. In Hungary, the Trianon borders were restored, and the Hungarians were forced to pay reparations to their neighbours. Hungarian citizens were also abducted and taken to work in labour camps without pay in this now devastated country. The Hungarian People's Republic was declared in August 1949 under the brutal leader of Stalinist Mateusz Rákosi. Czechoslovakia was the only place where the Communists won a legitimate election, winning 38% of the vote in 1946. Voters reacted well to the Communists' anti-Germanism. The German minority in the Sudetenland and Prague were removed from their homes and expelled from the country, as was the Hungarian minority in Slovakia. The Czechs took revenge upon the Germans for the wartime years by committing many atrocities against them. The Communists staged a coup in spring 1948 that left them in full control of the country. Jan Masaryk, the last democratic minister in government, was found dead outside of a window one chilly March morning. Whether this was suicide or murder remains unknown.